Past the orange roof and turquoise tower, past the immense sunburst of the green and yellow sign, past the golden arches, beyond the low buff building, beside the discreet hut, the dark top hat on the studio window shade, beneath the red and white longitudes of the enormous bucket, coming up to the thick shaft of the yellow arrow piercing the royal blue field. He feels he is home. Is it Nashville? Elmira, New York? St. Louis County? A Florida Key? The Illinois Arrowhead? Indiana like a holster? Ohio like a badge? Is he north? St. Paul, Minnesota? Northeast? Boston? Massachusetts? The other side of America? Salt Lake? Los Angeles? At the bottom of the country? The Texas udder? Where? In Colorado's frame? Wyoming like a postage stamp? Michigan like a mitten? The chipped, eroding bays of the Northwest? Seattle? Bellingham, Washington? Somewhere in the packed masonry of states. Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast that is ordinarily dedicated to discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. This week, however, as we are amidst our series of bonus episodes, it has come to my turn to talk about something that I'm interested in, and my choice this time around is The Franchiser by Stanley Elkin, a novel published in, I believe, 1974, maybe 1976. And it is a book that represents not only the only Stanley Elkin book that I have ever read so far, especially after reading this now, there are plenty more that I want to read, but also an indication of just how you never really know how you're going to end up changing sort of your list of your favorite books of all time, or what might consist your top 10 list. It can happen at any time. This was not initially what I was going to talk about for this bonus episode. Initially, I was going to talk about a book called Flat Earth by Annika Jade Levy, but then the library finally got back to me on locating this book in its storage unit. And by the time I had finished reading it, it had completely consumed every bit of my attention over the sort of month that I spent just diving into it. And it became very evident that it was the only thing I really had any interest in talking about at length for a bonus episode. Sorry, Annika, if you're listening for some reason. Maybe we'll talk about your book at another time. But Stanley Elkin is kind of a interesting, lesser, not regarded, but perhaps overlooked is probably the best way to look at, lesser recognized sort of writer from what is probably considered the postmodern tradition. His work isn't necessarily as experimental as someone like Pynchon or Gaddis or some of the sort of Mount Rushmore-esque figures of the postmodern tradition, but he was operating in a light experimental nature. There is some experimentation in The Franchiser. From what I understand, there is also some experimentation in the relationship between the book and the reader in some of his other books that he's published to great acclaim at the time. But he is a very interesting author within the tradition because of his focus on systems. Outside of the kind of postmodern tradition of experimentation and composition, there's also a lot of usage of an analysis of the greater systems of society, be that capitalism, be that the government, be that war, be that culture, art, whatever it might be, and its effects down to the individual sort of human level on one or a couple of people. This is the easiest way that I can think of to define what a systems novel is in the first place. And that's what Stanley Elkin is really all about. That's what he is most invested in the writing that he does, as I understand it. And The Franchiser is considered one of his sort of keynote novels. He's got a couple. The Franchiser is there. There's also a book called The Dick Gibson Show that is considered to be amongst his best. Those are sort of the two keystones, and then from there, there's a lot of kind of debate about what his best other books are. Some people will say MacGuffin is right up there, and then you'll have people from other camps arguing for different books of his. But he wrote a lot over his life. He is somebody who published a fair amount of novels. He was also within academia for most of his sort of critical writing period. He taught at one of the sort of strangest universities in name that I've ever come across. I believe it's at the back of my edition of this. Yes, he was the professor of English at Washington University in St. Louis. um, how that name came about, I don't know, but every time I read that, it made me laugh because it feels like something that would be present potentially in his books. And he taught there until he died. He lived between 1930 and 1995. In addition to his novels, he wrote plenty of short stories as well, which are just as acclaimed. How I came to this book is kind of an interesting story in and of itself. I spend probably way too much time on the Dalkey Archive website or the Deep Vellum website, their associated publishing house. And they have an essential series, if you're not familiar with Dalkey Archive, of sort of, they're not all big books, but a lot of them are big books that they have republished that have been out of print for a really long time, but that they see as particularly essential to the development of literary fiction. Most recently, they've republished The Tunnel in April, the month that this is being recorded. And one day I was just kind of looking through all of the books that are in that Essentials series, and I knew most of them. The Franchiser came up on the list, and it was one that I was completely unfamiliar with. Not just the author, but the book itself. However, it had two introductions that came with the edition. First was a republication of a 1980 introduction written by apparently his close personal friend William H. Gass. In his introduction, William Gass mentions that the two of them are close friends. So that's pretty crazy in and of itself, especially, of course, given the Dalkey connection of the republication of The Tunnel. And then, with their republication of this book, they include an introduction written by Adam Levin. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Adam Levin, you should change that. He is one of the kind of boundary-pushing authors in American letters working right now. And there's really no place that you can go wrong with his books, whether it's his short story collection Hot Pink, or his longer books like Mount Chicago or Bubblegum, or his most sort of well-regarded novel, The Instructions, which is published by McSweeney's and republished 2 years ago in a new edition that's in 2 volumes. He's a absolute genius of sort of the literary fiction form. And so, knowing that I like both of those authors, I figured this has to be pretty good. And so this led me to see if my local library had it. I'm trying to cut down on buying books that I haven't read. It's not always going so great. But it said that my local branch did have a copy and that nobody was reading it currently. So I requested it, and then like a week went by and they still hadn't pulled it. And then like another week went by, and then they sent me an email, and they said, it turns out that this book that you're looking for is actually in our storage, what they call the lower stacks, and we're gonna have to find it.
That's don't know. Wild.
Yeah, I know. And they said we don't know how long it's gonna take us to find it, but we'll send you another notification once we locate the copy. And then I waited about another month until eventually I got another email from them saying that they had found it and that it was waiting for me to pick up. When I arrived at the library, what I was greeted by in the holds area was a first edition hardcover of this novel that still had the old card catalog envelope pasted in the front and back of the book. And it had not been checked out since 1982.
Damn.
I don't know how long it sat on the shelf before they put it into storage, but the sadder thing wasn't just that it hadn't been checked out since 1982. Only 4 people had ever checked this book out before they put it into storage. And so I brought it home, and I was very intrigued at this point about what it is that I was in for. I didn't really read too much on it. I read sort of a basic plot kind of blurb off of the Goodreads entry for the book. And then later on, when I got really into it, I listened to Adam Levin's interview about writing the introduction for the book. And I was not at all prepared for how mind-blowing of a story this would be. To kind of provide a basic overview of the plot, and this is definitely a book that I would say benefits from you not knowing much going into it. So much of my discussion here is going to be in broad detail. There's a lot of really exciting stuff that I wish I could just tear apart and get deep into, but I think part of what made this such an enjoyable reading experience for me was the fact that I did not know what Stanley Elkin was working towards for most of the book. And there are several points in the book where the disposition between the protagonist and the reader shifts with new information that is revealed as the story goes on. And broadly, I don't care about spoilers, but this is one case where it really feels like your understanding of the character and the way that your disposition towards him changes almost goes in tandem with the degradation of the character's health issues. And the character has MS. So the overall sort of storyline of the book, if I was to provide a blurb, is that it is about a man named Ben Flesh, whose father dies at the same time as his mother in a car accident, and he is suddenly summoned to the deathbed of his godfather. And his godfather was in business with his father a long time ago. They made theatrical costumes for stage productions. And at one point, the two sort of business partners went their separate ways, and the godfather basically paid out Ben Flesh's father for his share of the business because he had the money to do so, and held on to exclusive rights because he knew that it was an industry that was growing and that it was going to boom and it was going to make him really wealthy. But he did not warn or tell Ben Flesh's biological father this was going to happen. He basically saw an opportunity to rip off his business partner and took it. And that guilt has been eating away at him for a really long time. And so hearing about what has happened to Ben's biological parents, the guilt causes him to summon Ben to his deathbed, where he is actively undergoing some sort of medical issue. And he basically says, I've been carrying this guilt for a really, really long time. I haven't really known what to do with it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add you to my will. But I have had a huge amount of children. I think at one point the number is 16 as far as the number of children that he's had with his wife. But they've all been born in pairs of twins or in pairs of triplets. So he's never just had one kid at a time. And this causes him to feel some sort of affinity for the idea of a singular heir. And so he thinks that maybe Ben Flesh can be that for him. But at the same time, he doesn't want to feel like he's slighting his biological children, so he's not going to give Ben money. What he is going to do is he is going to guarantee Ben Flesh the prime interest rate on any business loans that he wants to take out. And his children are the ones who have to guarantee those loans for him and borrow him the money. So this is sort of the negotiation that begins the book between the two of them. And Ben Flesh, after getting to know his sort of siblings, his god siblings, realizes that what he wants to do is own franchises. And what follows is a book in which he is actively working towards the opening of a new franchise. It's a hotel. It's going to be his biggest franchise yet, his biggest investment yet, and the thing that he thinks is finally going to sort of set him up for life. But as he goes about acquiring what he needs for the hotel, he is visiting his other franchises, which are dotted all across the United States. And he has a whole portfolio of them. But as he goes on this sort of cross-country trip, he is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and that multiple sclerosis begins to degrade. And again, like I kind of mentioned at the top of this description, our opinion of Ben Flesh, or our disposition towards him, begins to degrade and go back and forth, just like the illness, as it achieves remission and then loses remission over the course of the book. Now, there is a very obvious allegory that one can draw here. This idea of consumerism, opening businesses, opening franchises in particular, as being inherently sort of degrading to one's soul, right? This idea of perpetual consumerism. And if you read reviews, the few that exist on Goodreads or other sort of aggregation websites, you'll find that a lot of people hone in on that, and then they just say that that is all this book represents, and that the allegory is actually very simple, the commentary is very easy to digest, and that's kind of it. I would argue that that is not the correct interpretation of this. That yes, that conversation is there. That yes, the link between MS and consumerism and how it affects Ben Flesh's existence as a person is there. But there is a lot more nuance going on in how this book is constructed and in the sort of detail of the broader structure that Stanley Elkin is trying to work in, which is the destruction of Main Street in service of Wall Street in the United States. This book came out in the 70s, a time when sort of the dream of the 60s had died, like completely put away in its coffin, but not yet was approaching the 80s when sort of international consumerism and the American consumerist culture and hypercapitalism that we kind of now live in the after effects of got started. So it exists and was published at this very interesting tipping point where you would not quite have the expansions of big business and consumerism and capitalism that would come, but the kind of old way of doing things, the idea that you would have like a local grocery store and a local gas station and a local diner, and you know, you would maybe have a person in your town who made shoes for most of the people in the town, or you know, owned a business that most of those people patronized, wasn't fully gone either. And it's this weird kind of tipping point. And Ben Flesh really represents, in a way, the kind of Steinbeckian idea of the average American not viewing themselves as poor or in a disadvantaged social class, but as viewing themselves as a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, as he would put it, and depicts one man's attempts to claw out of embarrassment just into the status of being a millionaire. And before I continue, I'm going to start with my first quote here, which comes from the scene where Ben is brought to the deathbed of his godfather. And his godfather begins to go on a rant, one of many rants that make up a lot of this book, about sort of the impossibility of being, I guess is maybe the way that I would put it. The nurse handed Ben the splinter. He took it and slipped it into his wallet with his pocket money and return ticket. "How crowded is the universe?" his godfather said, and moved the plastic arm vaguely. "How stuffed to bursting with its cargo of crap. Consider, Ben, you could have been a pencil, or the metal band that holds the eraser to the wood, the wire of lead that runs through it, the black N in number 2 stamped along one of its 6 sides, or one of its 6 sides. Or the thin paint on another. You could have been a vowel on a typewriter, or a number on a telephone dial, or a consonant in books. There are thousands of languages, millions of typewriters, billions of books. You might have been the oxygen I breathe, or the air stirred by this sentence. It is a miracle that one is not one of these things. A miracle that one is not a thing at all. That one is animal rather than mineral or vegetable, and a higher animal rather than a lower. You could have been a dot on a die in a child's Monopoly set. There are 21 dots on each die, 42 in a pair. Good God, Ben! Think of all the dice in the world! End to end, they'd stretch to the sun. Then there are the rich, the blooded with their red heritage like a thoroughbred silks. You might have been a stitch in those silks. A stitch in any of the trillions of vestments, pennants, gloves, blankets, and flags that have all existed until now. Let me ask you something. How many people live? Consider the size of their wardrobe over the years. A button you could be, a pocket in pants, a figure on print. I was discussing the rich. There are many wealthy, more than you think. I'm not just talking beneficiaries either. Next of kin, in-laws, distant cousins, the king's mishpach, the emperors, but the rich man himself, the wage earner, the founder, fly in an airplane in a straight line across one state, you couldn't count the mansions or limousines. You couldn't count the swimming pools. So many, Ben, you're not one of them. And not one of the family. And still, you exist. I am talking the long shot of existence. The odds no gambler in the world would take that you would ever come to life as a person, a boy called Ben Flesh. He was very excited. He raised himself on the boards taped to his arms and leaned toward me, speaking so close to the oxygen tent that within each word he seemed about to take some of it into his mouth. Think of their last lines. How many do you suppose have been of their last lines? Queers, say, or the imperfectly pelvic or ball-torn, or so wondrously ugly they could never make out and didn't have the courage or the will to rape. Whatever the reason, the last of their lines, end of the road, everybody out. How many? 40 million? 50? I don't have the statistics. I'm reminded of those rich men again. You could have been the paper for a stock or a bond. You could have been change in somebody's pocket or a lost dollar nobody found. But at least 50 million. So great a number. Yet you managed to be born. You made it anyway. You wormed your way. And if you happen to be white, that's a miracle. Squared. Are you following my argument? White people are a minority, you know. As land is to sea, white is to black, to yellow and mongrel pack. So we keep compounding the miracle like the interest rate on money never touched. It's incredible, really. Amazing. Who could believe it? You weren't aborted. You didn't end up in a scumbag. You survived the infant mortality stuff. You made it past measles, polio, mumps. You outwitted whooping cough, typhoid, VD. God bless you, boy. You're a testament to the impossible. And not just that, but you aren't broken or damaged. There are no birth defects. You've your full complement of fingers, your fair share of toes. Your brains are present and accounted for. You're literate. You do sums. You're on the dean's list at Wharton. I know. And even without parents, you've got clothes, shelter, sex, what to eat, you know. The drives, the hydramatics of being, 4 on the floor, and more where that came from, yes. And you get the point of jokes and have a favorite movie, and maybe even the room where you stay is done up in your best color. My God, lad, you're a fucking celebration. This goes on for many pages. But it is, again, I think, an illustration of not just the fact that there is going to start a character who is seen as this sort of like miracle or pristine individual that is going to become the exact opposite of all of those things. But there is also a very clever commentary in there about the difference between millionaires and people who own mansions and have pools with the people who are actually sort of founders, this idea of starting something. And technically, the man guaranteeing this money to Ben is one of those. And Ben is not. He's not a founder, but he's going to try to become one. But because he is born into a system in which he has the ability to start a business in the sense of a franchise, that he is able to, you know, open a McDonald's or open a Howard Johnson's or whatever, he can become one of those sort of millionaires, but he'll never be a founder. And that, I think, is a bigger statement on again, this degradation to the society that these hyper capitalist dreams or hyper, you know, consumeristic dreams create. It isn't just that this affects Ben in a physical way as the book goes on, but it also affects the fact that he is never going to rise to anything. Like, yeah, he may have more money. Yes, he may technically be a business owner in the sense that he's the person responsible for what happens in that store, but he doesn't own McDonald's. He doesn't own Howard Johnson's. He doesn't own any of this. And there's a scene eventually in the book where he's compared to Colonel Sanders, which in his mind is like the sort of god that he worships almost. This man who was able to turn himself into a franchise. And I don't want to spoil that scene because it's incredible for a number of reasons, but that is another step of the development of this sort of allegory that Elkin is working on, or this kind of depiction of what happens as we move towards this hyper-consumerist society that inherently separates the 1% from the bottom 99, even down to the people who could be considered business owners. And of course, there is the MS element. Now, the interesting thing within the MS element in this book is that Stanley Elkin actually had MS himself. And a lot of the sort of process that Ben Flesh goes through in his initial diagnosis of MS and being treated for it does actually come out of his own experience. There's a couple of different interviews that you can listen to in which Stanley Elkin compares the two sort of moments of his own life and of Ben Flesh's life where that initially happens. So you can also see that there is very clearly something in this book where he is trying to work out his own negotiations with the illness, or is trying to square away something that has happened to him through the diagnosis that he received of MS. And from what I understand, it was the degradation of his body that led to his death from MS, but he kept writing through his entire life. There's another interview you can listen to where he talks about how his writing process has changed from when he was able to, write things with a pen or a pencil or a typewriter to eventually needing a device that would assist him to do that. And there are a lot of writers who try to do what Elkin does, where they kind of impart the feeling of illness or the feeling of being in a body to the reader. It's a very difficult thing to do. However, this book made me frightened of MS in a way that I don't think I ever have been frightened of an illness or sort of a condition by a book before. It's easy to kind of not necessarily write off, but explain away MS as just, a loss of feeling in your nerve endings or something like that. But it is a degenerative illness that does eventually, take more than that from you. And Elkin's ability to describe the feeling of MS, based in part on his own experience, really transposes that feeling to the reader in a way that is eerie. And I have another quote here that I want to share that gets into the details of how he does that. This comes from much later in the book, once his illness has kind of advanced in a way that he had hoped it wouldn't. He'd been calling them, feeding them his symptoms, the heavy weather, all the isobars and thunderheads of his multiplying sclerosis. It was crazy, but it was as if the days when his parasitic hands had troubled him, when his skin crawled in anything but natural fibers, when the nerves in his feet sent out shoots of electric quiver, had been a golden age, the halcyon good old days of manageable discomfort. Now his body shipped a queer, illicit cargo of intolerable contraband sensation. Things no torturer could make up. His body a host to amuck feeling. And all still below the level of pain. Things not pain. As if pain, as he remembered it, was only a matter of the degree of things honed and sharp. Tender through sore to pinched. Some verb wheel of friction and thorned flesh. Only the surgical cutlery of bruise, nip, sting, stitch, ache, and cramp. Pain, he thought, he could take. Or could have afforded the addiction that would have purchased relief. These other things, these new proliferating sour dispensations, were something else. And lived, thrived, he knew. He'd tried them. Beneath all the powerful analgesics, Demerol, codeine, laudanum, morphine, and had held back from his god cousins the really big stuff. The monstrous that he dared not put in words, dared not try them with. Held back all that was unimaginable. Sounds that tickled his eardrums, his tongue rubbed raw in his saltwater saliva, the steady, constant Antarctic cold of his hands and feet and eyelids. He could not endure air conditioning, and wore thick furred gloves in even the hottest weather. The impression he had that his body was actually striped like a zebra's. The dark strips of skin and flesh, or what he imagined were the dark strips, he could see that he was not really striped. Heavier somehow than the light, harder to negotiate in gravity. The sensation he had that he was wet, deep inside his body. Wet where he could not get to it. Like someone with an unreachable itch, where he could not dry it with towels or rub it with toilet paper, though he tried. Though he wiped and wiped himself. He always felt as if he sat in some medium of diarrhea, minced, oozy, slippery shit, Also, his olfactory system was faultily wired so that he hallucinated tastes and smells, confused them crazily with their sources till finally, experimentally breaking the code, he ordered desserts and cakes at dinner if he felt like seafood. Seafood if his body craved meat. Meat if he had a taste for something sweet. Had not told them any of this, who kept on now. He couldn't say why, couldn't account for why he did not kill himself, or had not died. By dint of a will and a set of motives he knew to be as illusory and unfounded as his impression that his body was striped. I have arrived, he told Oscar, at a stage of my life where I must manufacture reasons to keep going. But not explaining this further. Certainly not giving any indications that his love for them might be one of those reasons. But perhaps he didn't believe this himself. So it's incredibly effective writing about the condition that he experiences. And it is one of the genius aspects of how this book sells the idea that these carceral systems of capitalism and consumerism both can provide a sense of investiture in an individual while also killing them. Because even though Ben Flesh is not a perfect person, and as the book goes on, you kind of begin to dislike him, there is still something in you, especially I think if you're reading this as an American, that wants him to succeed and kind of feels this need to continue to propel him forward. At no point in the book did I throw up my hands and be like, give up the franchises, buddy. Like I wanted to see where it was headed. I wanted to see if he was going to actually make it, which makes the climax of this book, which I won't describe because it is something unlike anything I've ever read. So devastatingly beautiful in its impact. Because the climax of this book comes really late in the book, and it's when the hotel opens. And at that point, you know, you've watched this character go through so much. You've watched him try to struggle to get to this point. And then when the hotel opens and what happens, for me, it really ties up a lot of the sort of elements of what he's working towards in a perfect way. And the interplay between Ben and the god siblings who guarantee his loans is also a perfect evocation of this idea that we as an American society, by patronizing these businesses, by, you know, allowing them to open with such frequency, allowing them to function, are in a way killing ourselves in the process. You know, the siblings are the one who push him to open franchises. It's a whole scene early on in the book when Ben explains how he ended up doing that instead of starting his own company. And then as these things begin to affect Ben negatively, eventually it cascades out to the god siblings, and they try to get him to stop. But Ben is so hell-bent on this direction that he's taking it that he doesn't want to, and he's over-leveraged and can't. And it ends up having such a negative effect on everybody that, especially reading it now, coming through, you know, the '08 financial crisis and now the recession that we're obviously entering in America again, it really does sell this idea of like, yeah, we've done it to ourselves. We have absolutely done it to ourselves. You know, this death of Main Street and the birth of Wall Street came from convenience and ease, and we were willing to allow that to happen because it felt good at the time. And now that we've noticed that it's not good, it's far too late for us to do so. And part of the systems that Elkin gets into that are so smart is he analyzes the way in which this over-reliance on franchising, this over-reliance on corporate consumerism, and the expansion of consumerist elements in general in the culture actually leads to a downgrade in culture. You know, like we're calling Chipotle slop bowls now, or different things like that. You know, no one pays $12 for their burger at McDonald's and feels good about it. You know, we all feel like we're getting ripped off. We all feel like the options that exist now are so bad. And Elkin really, I think, nails this in the 70s before a lot of this happens. And one of my other quotes here, I think, is a really brilliant example of it, where he's Ben Flesh is spending some time with one of the god siblings who's referred to as the one with insight. And she and him go to this hotel that has a restaurant. And this exchange is what follows. And no small talk even at dinner in one of the hotel's restaurants. The menu her muse. "Oh, look," she said. "Look at the menu." They were in the Penrose room at the top of the old building with its view of the Rockies beyond a solid wall of glass. Feel it. The paper like a certificate of stock, blue chip. If you look close, you can see the tiny colored threads that run through it like a precious aspic of lint on money. "I can look close, but I can't feel it," Ben said. "Look at the cursive font, distinctive as signature. The prices like distinguished addresses. My hand." "Oh, Ben," she said. "It's as if printing costs determine the range of one's appetite and fix it forever. Movable type and the destiny of hunger. When this menu was designed, it was designed once and for all. The chef and the man from graphics and consultation, preordained. Don't you see? By what would look good on the document. For that's what such a menu becomes, a document, legal and binding. Yes, a contract, if you please." "What do you do best?" the graphics man must have asked. "Decide now, because you can't change your mind later. The cost of this thing is like putting out a magazine." And he would have had to have told him. Don't you see what it means? Image and printing costs are responsible for the tradition of mediocrity in American restaurants. "But the chef is doing what he does best," Ben said. "And how long must he do it? Change to a years-old assembly line expertise? He must finally get bored. The quality has to suffer. How can he experiment? Where can he try out new recipes?" "The food's supposed to be very good here," Ben said. "Oh, Ben, don't be naive. Idiom only is informed. Stop, it tells us, where the truck drivers do. Do you suppose a truck driver's palate is more knowledgeable than a rich man's?" "But you said..." "It's because they don't usually have printed menus in such places. A mimeographed sheet shoved between a hard clear plastic and tucked like a snapshot into the corner mounts in a photo album. Yes, and the blue plate special in blue. You've seen him, surely you of all people, Ben, with your 70,000 miles a year. You've seen him, the owner of the diner or the cook at a truck stop, up on the last stool at a counter an hour before closing, with his stencil in the typewriter and his hunt in his peck doing tomorrow's menu. Usually such places the food is lousy. The food, perhaps. The principle, not at all. I don't know this for a fact, but it's my guess that the Michelin people rarely list restaurants where the menus look like the Magna Carta." "Try the Rocky Mountain rainbow trout," Ben said. She was looking off in the distance. Ben followed her glance. Apparently she was studying a table of 7 people near the western wall of glass. "Never so much the family," she said, "as when sitting together in a restaurant. The group leavened by an outsider, the daughter's boyfriend or the son's pal from university, say. A grandfather there, a father to pick up the check, a younger son 10. It's the simultaneity of ease and showing off what makes the effect work." "You're an expert on atmosphere," Ben said. "But if you want to know, it's the simultaneity of generations which does that." "What is it?" she asked. "Is something wrong?" "I wanted to tell someone," he said. "I wanted to tell someone what's in store for me. And all you do is give me the significance drill. You told me your symptoms. You gave me Gibbard's prognosis. It's very hopeful." "I want my remission back," he said, and burst into tears. So again, yes, the overall comparison, and yes, the overall kind of allegory and ideas that Stanley Elkin is trying to present might seem simple, but when you drill deep into the text, he is providing something that is significantly more profound than just the idea of consumerism and capitalism kills the body. He is actively, I think, elucidating the future we live in now and how that started. This idea of selling someone on a dream, giving them a promise, only for them to get trapped essentially as a different type of wage worker. And the ways in which he analyzes that and the ways in which he analyzes the effect that that has on other people in society and how that kind of rolls and cascades out, I think is absolutely genius. The book has only grown in my estimation since I read it, and it's one that once I finished it, I really had to like physically almost restrain myself from going back through and starting the book over again. And it was really hard to do because by then I had ordered a physical copy of it, and I wanted to read the William H. Gass intro and I wanted to read the Adam Levine intro. And then when I got through those two, I was like, well, I could just like start the book again. But I was able to sort of control that impulse and put it away. But it is in my top 10 books of all time. It is one of the best reading experiences that I have ever had in just going into a book blind and being completely blown away by what it is that I was given. And it's, I think, an important illustration of why publishers are important. And the other reason I wanted to talk about this is because last year, Dalkey Archive and Deep Vellum were defunded as a result of the sort of government cutbacks instituted by Doge. A lot of their money that was being used for either purchasing and republishing books or translating important works of literature all evaporated. And that was a huge part of their operating capital and a huge part of what allowed them to continue to do the work that they're doing. And yes, it is important that they are putting out stuff like The Tunnel and The Sotweed Factor and these big books that are canonized and well known. But the people who are working at publishing houses like Deep Vellum and like Dalkey or other, not necessarily indie presses, but these sort of mid-tier boutique presses are doing really, really important work. And in a day and age in which it feels like we have access to criticism about everything and we can, go and look up any author or any book that we might be interested in and add it to an endless TBR, I think that there is a very real benefit to sometimes just sort of like taking a swing on a book and taking a swing on a book either because an author that likes it or someone else, points you towards it, like on this podcast or any other podcast, and to support the ongoing work of houses like Dalkey and Deep Vellum. Because if we don't support them, if we don't especially take a swing on some of their books that are probably, not selling as well as others, I still haven't received my pre-order of The Tunnel, and it's because it's sold out immediately. Those are always going to be there, and those are always going to be something that they can sell and make money on. But where a lot of publishers can get some additional support for the work that they do is buying their lesser known volumes and lesser known titles. And so that would be the other piece of why I wanted to talk about this as an as sort of a PSA to purchasing books that maybe aren't on your list, or to looking at things that maybe you haven't heard of, and supporting the work of publishers who are putting those out. If you can trust a publisher enough to spend $30 on a re-release of something, then chances are a lot of the other stuff that they're putting out is really good and really worth your time. And I think that The Franchiser by Stanley Elkin is absolutely the best illustration that I've come across in recent history of that idea.
As much as I would love to ask a question, I don't have one. Primarily because you were very thorough in your description, and also your warning about spoiling it makes me want to like refrain from anything that I might ask that might potentially push towards that.
Yeah.
Suffice to say, I am definitely bumping this up on my TBR, and I love when you find something like that where you don't really plan on it becoming, or you don't go into it anticipating it being some kind of like complete game changer, and it becomes that, and it's such a special feeling, and I love that you got to have that, and I really look forward to reading this. I've never heard of the author or the book, so I'm like, this was totally brand new for me, and I'm really looking forward to trying to find a copy of it somewhere.
Yeah, I know that the last time I was on Dalkey's website, their edition of the franchise was sold out. I don't know if that means that they're not going to have it available anymore, or if they're just waiting on another printing to arrive. But that would be the place to go. Would be Dalkey. There are also a lot of first edition hardcovers that you can find on eBay or other places where you can find books like that. If you can't get a contemporary copy of it, from what I understand, it was out of print from 1980 until Dalkey republished it last year. So it came out in hardcover, came out in paperback as they do, then was republished in paperback in 1980 with the Gas intro, and then was just gone until Dalkey picked up the rights to it. So there are not a lot of editions for people to pick up, but it does seem as though they are available at a relatively cheap price, especially for the age of a lot of them, because of, again, how kind of obscure the book and the author sort of remains. He seems to me to be another case, kind of like what Luke was talking about in his bonus episode about a writer's writer. Someone who's really revered by a lot of other people working in a similar genre space as he is, but doesn't sort of break out of that mold into the greater culture very often. And just as like a fun final anecdote to accompany my story about getting the book from the library, I now own what used to be John Updike's personal copy of the Franchiser.
That's wild.
Yeah, the publisher, FSG, gifted him a copy at the request of Stanley Elkin, and for some reason, John Updike sold it to a bookstore in, I think it was Rhode Island or Massachusetts. And the owner of the bookstore asked him to sign it, even though it wasn't his book.
Huh.
And he did sign it in pencil and left a really weird inscription. And then I bought it from the owner of the bookstore. And it still has, what's really cool is it still has the business card of the editor-in-chief of FSG at the time, and the like little with compliments of the author card from Stanley Elkin to John Updike.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
How is the book similar at all to the works of Saul Bellow? Because there were some things that you said that kind of reminded me of Saul Bellow.
I have not read any Saul Bellow, so I don't know.
Okay.
But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if at the very least their writing style was a little bit of the same. Like in researching Stanley Elkin, just sort of more broadly, like Bellow came up in conversation. And I might be crazy, but if I'm not, there was a quote by Saul Bellow floating around that is about Stanley Elkin. So they were contemporaries of each other, and Stanley Elkin seems to be pretty well respected by a lot of other people in the literary fiction field of the time that he was sort of at his peak in writing.
Okay.
All right. So I think that brings us to the end of this bonus episode. If anyone just wants to have a conversation with me over email about the Franchiser, you can feel free to email anything else. It's a book that, again, I can talk about endlessly, but I don't want to reveal too much on the podcast forum here.
Sure.
So you can always get in touch with us at any of our many ways to get in contact. mappingthezonepod@gmail.com is the easiest, but we are also available for comment on Instagram at mappingthezone. We are on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We are on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone, and we are on YouTube at Mapping the Zone as well. I think you can still direct message people on YouTube. Maybe you can't.
I don't know.
But if you can't, I guess you can just leave a comment on one of our videos and be like, hey, I have no other social media or email, but I have this question about the franchise brigade. And I will happily reply to you. I could talk about this book for a really long time. But until I inevitably force everyone else to read it as maybe a season of the show in 10 years' time when we're done with Pinch On, that will do for talk on the Franchiser for now. As always, if you like what we're doing and you want to support the show, the easiest way for you to do so is by donating directly to our Ko-Fi project. We are on Ko-Fi at mappingthezone.com. Any funds you do donate to us will be used to pay for hosting fees and equipment upgrades or books that we may need in order to do the show. If you want something, some sort of swag to go along with your donation, then you can buy merch from us at our spread shop. We are on spread shop at Mapping the Zone as well. And I believe we have one more bonus episode coming out after this one for Will, who's unfortunately not with us. But then from there, we will be right back to our regularly scheduled programming with Against the Day. And I know we are all really excited about that and not at all wondering what's in store for us when we flip over to the next section of the book. So until next time, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
I
Bye.